Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we will be taking a look at the James Madison Dukes, who finished an impressive 11-2 in 2023 and only their second season in the FBS, and they went to their first ever bowl game in the Armed Forces Bowl. They recently wrapped up their 2024 spring practice for their spring game on April 20th. We have a special guest joining us today. Please welcome to the show, Shane Mettlen. Shane covers JMU athletics for the Daily News Record. He is a member of the United States Basketball Writers Association and the Football Writers Association of America. He is the co-host of the Purple and Bold and the Fun Belt podcast. Shane can be found at Shane_DNR Sports on X. Welcome to the show, Shane.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're glad you're here. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to be interested in sports journalism and covering the JMU Dukes?
Yeah, I mean, getting into sports journalism in general was kind of one of those things where like we all love sports when we're kids, right? And then at some point, it dawns on you like, hey, my career is not going to be playing in the NBA or whatever. And if you want to stay in sports, you find something to do. And kind of in my tiny hometown in the Midwest, it was kind of like, most people would like go into teaching and become a coach if they really wanted to stay in sports. And I didn't really want to teach that much. I did okay in English. It just kind of became something I thought I might really like to do. I was one of those guys who picked up the newspaper and took out the sports section and poured over that every day growing up. And eventually it kind of like dawned on me as like, yeah, maybe I could write those articles and be that guy. So that's kind of how I got there. And then wound up on the East Coast after college, and family wound up settling down in Virginia here in the Shenandoah Valley, which is a really lovely place to live and raise kids and relatively affordable and everything else, and just love it here. And so I'm fortunate enough to cover JMU, which has turned into a big time athletic department, which kind of gives you the best of both worlds around here. It's smallish town feel, but also got some great sports happening right now.
Yeah, they do. Actually, baseball's got a big game tonight, right? 6:30, I think. So
yeah. And that's even a surprise this season that the baseball team's got a chance for the NCAA tournament too. It's just been it's been a whirlwind kind of for JMU in this school year.
So, we talked earlier about how JMU had an impressive season in 2023 and also in 2022 for that matter. But obviously with success, especially when you're a G5, there's always some change that usually follows. And it's usually in the form of losing your head coach. So you guys lost your head coach and virtually all the coaching staff to Indiana this offseason. They do bring in Bob Chesney, who was previously the head coach at Holy Cross. What can you tell us about Coach Chesney and what he brings to the table for the Dukes?
Yeah, he's his resume is good. I mean, his track record is good. He's now been at the Division III, Division II, FCS level. He won big everywhere he's been, and at places that hadn't really won before. He comes to JMU and he's getting that shot at the FBS level now, and also probably the first time in his career that he's come in taking over a place where they've been winning, and maybe they're ahead of their peers in some things as far as like resources and facilities and things like that. So I think just thinking about it that way, you've got to expect he should be able to continue to have some success at JMU. Now, he's never coached quite at this high level. JMU's coming off an 11-win season, which is something that's going to be hard to match on a year in, year out basis. Things kind of clicked together perfectly last year. So, whether or not there's some growing pains, it's hard to say, but I think it was a really, really good hire on JMU's part to try to continue to build the momentum that the program has.
Yeah, I think JMU's done a really good job, like in recent history anyway, of coaching hires. At some point, you got to wonder, like, when does that string of luck kind of run out? But maybe this time it'll stick again.
Yeah, I mean, and you talk about that, and I don't know if it's always luck. There's a lot of it that has to do with kind of the culture of the school. They had an athletic director, Jeff Bourne, who was there for 25 years, and he had local ties and didn't look to move on. He made some really, really good hires, and football, basketball, across the board. He was good at hiring coaches. Now he just retired. They bring in Matt Roan from Eastern Kentucky. So it's it's up in the air, kind of what he does to kind of continue things. So far, he's made a good impression. But we'll wait and see. The good thing for him is he probably has a couple of years before he has to make a big hire again. We'll see, but hopefully they'll keep the guys in place for a little while.
I'm talking about coaching changes. I mean, and we were talking about other sports earlier. Basketball, we're gonna have a new coach, right? And
yeah.
So, yeah, big changes there at JMU across all sports. But getting back to football, as that often happens when you get that new head coach, it means new assistants and coordinators. JMU is no difference in that regard. Coach Chesney brings over Dean Kennedy with him from Holy Cross, where he served as the offensive coordinator. Can you describe the type of offense that Coach Chesney and Kennedy will bring with them and plan to run there at JMU?
It's not particularly easy to just describe it because they've done different things throughout the years where they've been. And, last year they had, one of the most dynamic dual threat quarterbacks in the country at Holy Cross. And so the offense really, it gravitated towards that. They had a lot of designed run plays for the quarterback. They threw the ball some, but, he had almost as many rushing yards as passing yards there at Holy Cross. But that hasn't always been like that for Holy Cross. And Chesney's teams, Kennedy's teams in general, they'll kind of adjust the play calling in particular and the designs of things to their personnel. And they're going to have a fairly deep running back room going into this season. At least it looks that way. And they bring in Dylan Morse, who I'm sure we'll talk about some more, as a quarterback, who's not the same kind of dual threat guy that they had, up there in Massachusetts. So it'll look a little different. And I think they're going to throw the ball more. I think it'll be more of a balanced run pass, but not so much with the design quarterback runs as we saw from Holy Cross the last couple of years.
So speaking of the quarterback, we'll move on over to there. They lose last season's starter and Sun Belt Player of the Year in Jordan McLeod, who transferred to Texas State. They brought in Dylan Morse from Washington, who you mentioned just a moment ago, and they return Alonzo Barnett III, Brett Griffiths, and Billy Atkins. How did the quarterback room look and shape up in the spring?
It looks like it's definitely Dylan Morris's job to lose. He's the guy who comes in who it's really kind of an interesting background for him. He was a starter early on in his career at Washington and does okay. He does pretty well in a shortened COVID season where they only played, I think, maybe 6 or 7 games. He ended up being, honorable mention all Pac-12. So he got off to a good start there. Then Michael Penix comes in to Washington, is having, back-to-back Heisman caliber seasons. And so he's not getting the same kind of playing time. He transfers out. He arrives at JMU. So, we'll see what he can kind of do at the Sun Belt level. But he brings experience. He brings things that I think, will probably end up winning him the job. Behind him, I think they probably got to feel a little bit better than they did in the last couple of years as far as their backup quarterback, just because, Alonzo Barnett has a little bit more experience. I think the change in coaching staff is probably good for him as far as like a fresh start. And I would expect him to probably be the number 2. He actually started the season opener last year. Yep. He looked good in through spring ball, through fall camp last year, and then really struggled in the season opener, his first college action, really. He struggled and never really kind of got over it. And I think like maybe the change of pace, a change of scenery with a new coaching staff potentially gives him a better opportunity to come in and maybe clear his head and be the number 2 guy. But, Billy Atkins also has some experience. Brett Griffiths, that name's kind of known. His brother was a starter at Wake Forest. He maybe doesn't have the same level of arm as the other guys, but he's a smart kid who I think if they end up having to put him in, he's a guy I don't think you expect to make too many mistakes. But it really looks like it's Morris's team to lead going into the fall.
So, we alluded to this earlier about Morris, and he's not, he's not really a dual threat. Not to say he can't move, but he's not going to rush for 1,400 yards like Matt Sluka did. Um, and then with Barnett kind of being the backup, as you mentioned, their styles are very different. And so, like from an offensive perspective, I realize they can adjust, but you would think maybe they don't want to change things too much. I mean, so like, how are they dealing with that contrasting styles with those two quarterbacks?
Yeah, I mean, they're different, and Barnett's definitely more of a runner. I would say he's still. I don't think he would be like a Sluka type, rushing for over 1,000 yards, but there might be more designed run, RPO type things if they go with Barnett. So I think that's part of the reason he won the job early last year too, is that he looked really good in those like RPO situations and things in practice. It didn't translate to his opportunity in the game, and they kind of pulled the cord on him really fast, probably knowing that they had talent behind him. But yeah, I think it's like I talked about earlier. I think what you'll see from the coaching staff is they will adjust things based on
if needed, I guess.
But at the same time, your playbook is your playbook to a certain degree. It's hard to completely change directions in the middle of the season if you have to change quarterbacks. But I'm guessing they'll have some things that both guys can do well.
Moving on to the running game, which had its share of success in 2023, but they lose their top 5 rushers from a year ago in Keon Black, Tyson Lawton, Latrell Palmer, but they rebuilt that room through the transfer portal, bringing in 1,000-yard rusher from North Texas, Ayo Adeyi, a former 4-star recruit, and George Pettaway from North Carolina, and Tyler Purdy follows that stuff over from Holy Cross. How is this running back room looking here in the spring?
Yeah, well, you mentioned the 3 guys that looked good in the spring, and I think will be on the field a lot. George Pettaway, at least in the spring game, he looked really good. He's got a ton of speed. I think he's a guy who's going to get a lot of carries. But Ayo Adeyi is the kind of the proven guy. He's somebody that they gave, I think, a lot of attention to. Even just sometimes you can tell what the coaches are thinking by like who they choose to come talk to the media after practice and things like that. And he's a guy who's been out there, and I think is going to be a key to the offense. And then Tyler Purdy, who you mentioned, he's the only guy on the roster that they list as athlete rather than another position, which was pretty interesting coming out of the spring game. He's a guy who I think, you'll see him in the backfield. You might see him in the slot other times. He's a bigger guy. He can maybe be a short yardage guy, but he's also going to catch the ball. So it'll be a different look with the running backs than it has been in previous years. 2 years ago, we talked off air about how hard it is to pronounce the names. Percy Ajay Obase. I always have to stop to get his name right. But he was their featured back a couple of years ago, and they were pretty solid in the running back department there. Last year was a little bit disappointing, maybe in like how they struggled to get a lot of yards after contact from their running backs. So I think that's one area where I would say no guarantees, but like it's almost expected they're going to be better than they were last year. Running back is one place where things are looking pretty good.
So former head coach Kurt Sinetti always seemed to take more of that committee running back approach. What have you seen from the new staff, and kind of what do you expect if we're going to see a healthy dose of the running game? Are we going to see a workhorse running back, a committee approach, 50-50, 40, 60-40?
I think committee, like, because all 3 of the guys we mentioned looked good in the spring. They look capable. They do some slightly different things. But, I would expect it to be sort of a committee type of situation. Maybe Adeyi, just with his experience and his proven track record, gets to nod more often than not. But I think all 3 of those guys are going to get touches.
So JMU last year was very successful passing the ball, featuring 2,000-yard receivers. Unfortunately, they lose them both, and Elijah Surratt, who followed the staff to Indiana, and then Reggie Brown, who graduated. They also lose third leading receiver Phoenix Sproles. They returned Tajee Hudson, Ymir Knight, Amarian Dollison, Maxwell Moss, Troy Lewis, and others. They bring in Cam Ross from UConn, Nakai Poole from Mississippi State. How did the wide receiver room look in the spring?
It's going to be, like you said, it's going to look a lot different. Some of those guys, did kind of stand out. Nakai Poole ended up leaving after spring ball because, I'm not sure he was as high on the depth chart as he was maybe expecting coming from Mississippi State. So he's gone, but Tajee Hudson had a really good spring. I think his role probably increases quite a bit going into next year. Omarion Dollison has shown flashes at times, was just kind of buried behind some of those guys last year. Those guys definitely have a chance to step up and get more done. To expect 2,000-yard receivers again, which they've had over the past couple of years, I don't know if that's necessarily reasonable to expect, because I just don't know if they're going to put up as many passing yards. I think it's going to be a little bit more balanced. So statistically they might not look as good, but they do seem to kind of have the spots filled anyway. And they were really, really good at the wide receiver spot last year. I mean, we'll continue to probably say that almost every position group we break down, they were good there last year. And, they might not be as good this year, but they do seem to have some guys who can compete, and they might not rely on them as much as they have in the past.
So they recently brought in a couple of more additions through the transfer portal. They brought in, or they got commitments anyway, from Breon Penny from San Diego State and Amarian Granger from Old Dominion. Do you think either of those two might have a shot at kind of cracking the starting rotation?
Yeah, I mean, I think they have a shot. I think it's pretty open to competition going into the fall, just at that position. And they bring those guys in for a reason, right? They're guys who have the G5 experience, and you didn't put up huge numbers, but have been on the field. If nothing else, it adds to the depth, which
sure.
I think, but having not seen a ton of those guys, it's hard to say. But I think, I think they were probably told coming in, hey, there's an opportunity to come in and compete for playing time, and they'll do that.
I realize here it is late May, and we got a lot can change before the first game at the end of August, 1st of September. But who do you think, if you had to pick who the starting receivers were against Charlotte in week 1, who do you think that might be?
Depending on what kind of set they go out in, I mean, I would probably guess Hudson, Dollison, maybe a Cam Ross, but you might see something strange where they got a couple guys in the backfield and, like we said, Tyler Purdy in the slot or something. So
sure.
Things could look weird at times. Things could look a lot different than the kind of formations we saw last year, where a lot of times it was, 3 or 4 wide receivers out there. But I think those guys are at least kind of guaranteed to get snaps, whether they're starting or not. It's hard to say, but I think we'll see a lot of those guys.
Gotcha.
Well, let's take a look at this tight end room. Can you describe for us how you expect the tight ends to be utilized in this Chesney Kennedy offense, and how much of a role will they have in the passing game?
Yeah, I mean, their role in the passing game will be there. They might be used in the running game as blockers even more than in the past. And that's to say, a guy like Zach Horton last year who had a really good year was a really good blocker, and he was a good blocker downfield. But they've got some size with their tight ends this year. Kai Wright was a guy we talked a little bit about offline, who is just a huge dude, and I think he might get a little bit more of an opportunity than he got last year. And Taylor Thompson coming in as a transfer guy who I think is probably going to be on the field a lot. He seems to be a good pass catcher. But similar to talking about the wide receivers, I don't know for sure how prolific they're going to be numbers wise compared to last year and the year before that, where they had guys at those positions putting up big stats, getting the all conference honors because of that. And I don't know if they're going to look for those guys to be as prolific maybe as in years past.
And then we talked about Kai Wright and Taylor Thompson, but they also bring in Logan Kyle from Vanderbilt this summer. Did anybody step up to assume that tight end one role there in the spring, or is that going to be a position battle come in the fall?
I think it's possibly a position battle, and I think it's a position where you may see a lot of guys rotating in and out, based on different things. But like I said, we didn't see everybody in the spring who's going to be in there battling for that. So it's another one of those positions where it's kind of hard to guess exactly who's going to start. But if I was going to put odds on it right now, I'd say, Taylor Thompson's probably the guy I would guess is on the field for the first snap. But again, I'm not sure how much that first snap matters as much as like who's getting what percentage of the snaps. And that could change based on a lot of factors.
So we've talked about a lot of position groups on the offense and all the personnel losses. The offensive line, though, seems to have fared much better compared to the other groups, losing only 2 starters from a year ago in Tyler Stevens and Carter Miller. They return Cole Potts, Tanner Morris, Tyshawn Wyatt, Josh Toner, and others. How did that unit look in the spring?
It's good, like you would expect. I mean, and it's not that they're necessarily going full contact a lot in the spring and everything, but I mean, it's an experienced group. You talked about losing the entire staff. Basically, the one guy who they thought was going to be back from the staff was Damian Roboleski, who was the offensive line coach, and he was the interim coach during the bowl game and everything. He ended up moving on to Maryland too. Like he had a lot of reasons, with his son's health to want to stay in this general vicinity. So he didn't go to Indiana, but then, the Big Ten money is hard to pass up for anybody, and he ends up at Maryland. That's a tough loss, but then, they bring in people who can replace them. The staff looks really good, but that's one thing where they might be a little different. They lose the continuity that otherwise they've got a lot of guys who have played a lot of snaps together, which is what you want in the offensive line. And, like you said, that's one area where there's not going to be a ton of new faces, and things are going to look much more similar than pretty much everywhere else on the offense.
All right, Shane, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season here in 2024, who are you picking?
That's a tough one, but it could be a Dylan Morris where maybe people have forgotten about him having that good year, back in 2021 for Washington, partially because they didn't play a ton of games and partially because it's been a while. But, if he ends up being one of the better quarterbacks in the Sun Belt, I wouldn't be shocked. On the other hand, I think people are looking for it maybe from AOAB, as we talk about running back. I think George Pettaway has a chance to be really good too. Maybe a guy who makes the big plays and, the long runs, the breakaway speed. So I don't know if they're going to have anybody who just puts up ridiculous stats like they've had in recent years. But, those are two guys who I think maybe by midseason people could be like, oh, wow, I kind of forgot about him. And, even though they came in with some accolades when they came into college.
Before we move on to the defensive side of the ball, something I was thinking about, here in the spring, did you notice any rapport being built up with Dylan Morris and a particular wide receiver in the room?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, Omarion Dollison maybe is a guy who I think he did it some last year too, with Jordan McLeod in a similar situation where the guy was coming in as a transfer and hadn't been around a lot. And, but they had some, prior history, and I think they connected pretty early on. And I think, just a guy who's been around for a while, Dollison is maybe one of those guys who recognizes, hey, it's also sort of on the wide receivers to help with this leadership and this transition and everything. And they're two guys who, when they talked about, who they connected with, I think there was, some chemistry there.
All right. Moving over to the defensive side of things, we also have a new coach there leading the way for the Duke's defense, and that is Lyle Hemphill. He comes to JMU from Duke, where he was most recently served as the co-defensive coordinator and the safeties coach. What style of defense can we expect to see from Coach Hemphill?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's similar to offensively, where they will adjust based on personnel, and they've got more experience at linebacker than necessarily in the secondary. The defensive line should be pretty solid. I think they're going to want to be aggressive up front, try to get to the quarterback, try to disrupt some things up front because they're, a little less settled and experienced in the secondary. So I think that'll be the case for the defense. And, Hemphill's a guy who there's a lot of energy on the coaching staff in general. But he's definitely a guy who, as he got there, gets on the field, gets out there with the players, you see a lot of, bounce from him, and, players kind of responded to that. So I think it's going to be fast and aggressive kind of defense, which is what JMU fans have kind of become accustomed to. But, as far as, schemes and everything like that, I think there's still some to be determined with that.
We kind of see like usually a stumbling of programs when a new coach comes in, because I feel like coaches are pretty stubborn and they want to run this certain offense or certain defense, and they maybe don't have that personnel there that they want to run. And that leaves me like a lot of optimism there for JMU in this next year with this coaching change. That, like you've said it multiple times, the coaches are going to coach to what they have. Like they're not going to try to fit a round or a square peg in a round hole. So that's exciting to hear.
Yeah, and I think some of that comes from things are a lot different now with the transfer portal, and you're replacing big chunks of your offense, and sometimes you're taking who you can get in the portal. But it also goes back to Chesney too. I think coming from the D2 and D3 ranks, you see that with D3 coaches in particular. Like you can either have, a very regimented style, like, okay, we're a triple option wishbone type of thing, and that's all we're ever going to do, and we'll just bring those guys in. Or a lot of D3 coaches are like, hey, well, the kid who wants to come here for engineering also is like a pretty good quarterback, so we're going to build our stuff around him. And, I think that's the way Chesney's kind of always been. And that, we talked about he doesn't have the FBS and the G5 experience, but sometimes that lower level experience can translate in a different way. And I think that's, something we've seen from him, is that his history of being adaptable because he had to be is probably going to show through at JMU too.
Awesome. Well, let's look at that personnel that will help run Coach Hemphill's defense. Let's start with the defensive line. The unit was very strong last year, as they ranked third in sacks per game in 2023 with 3.46. But much like the offense, they suffered a lot of lost production in the offseason. Jalen Green and Kamari Chroma are off to try their luck in the NFL. And then you got James Carpenter, Mikhail Kamara, and Tyreek Tucker, who transferred. They do return Emmanuel Bush and Amar Thomas, among others, and they bring in Terry Lockett Jr. from Syracuse, Lloyd Summerall from South Florida, DJ Cotton from West Virginia, and Eric O'Neill from Long Island. How did that unit look this spring, and did anyone stand out to you?
They looked solid, and Emmanuel Bush was probably the standout from the spring. A guy who he had been pretty good at Marshall before transferring to JMU, and then kind of got buried on the depth chart a little bit at JMU, because those guys you mentioned that they lost, like it was just an unbelievable performance by the defensive line last year. It's hard to even put into the words how dominant they were, especially the first probably 8 to 10 games when Jalen Green was there, having an All-American type season before he was lost to a knee injury. They just really controlled the game. The teams couldn't run on them at all. They were getting the sacks, like you said. And that made a difference in the ridiculous run totals because, obviously in college they factor sacks into lost yardage and running game. But even if you took that out, they were really, really good against the run. And we're playing basically those four guys the vast majority of the snaps, with Tyreek Tucker rotating in a little bit too. And, Emmanuel Bush didn't see the field quite as much, but I think he's a guy who's probably set to be the kind of the standout of that group this year based on what we saw in the spring.
Moving over to the linebackers, they lose their top two tacklers in 2023, Aiden Fisher and Jalen Walker, but they do return Torres Jones, Trent Hendrick, and Seth Nawatala, among others, and they bring in Raymond Scott from Fresno State, Jacob Dobbs from Holy Cross. How did the linebackers look in the spring?
They looked good, and that's the one where you mentioned some of those guys that are coming in transfers. Definitely helps with depth. Torres Jones coming back, I think, is going to be big. He's a guy who he didn't end up starting most of the games last year. He was an all Sun Belt caliber type of player in 2022, and then he has some nagging injuries early on. And Aiden Fisher gets in there and he ends up having like an incredible season and was too good to really take off the field. And you could see it at times, even at JMU, when you go to the post-game interviews, you kind of have to cut through a hallway that goes right by the locker room. And I mean, there were times like after games where you could see the frustration on Torres Jones' face coming out of the locker room. Like, as soon as they were done meeting, he would go off and kind of like just have to be by himself because he wasn't getting the playing time he wanted after a really good 2022 season. He was going to be in the portal kind of regardless of what happened with the coaching situation. And he went into the portal, but then decided to come out and stay at JMU after the coaching change. And he's a guy who I think has an opportunity and I think has the motivation to kind of get back to that level he was playing at. So it's kind of interesting because you look at, officially who's the returning starters. Torres Jones isn't one of those guys, but he, in a lot of ways, is a returning starter from a couple of years ago. And I think is set for a big year. And then of the newcomers, Jacob Dobbs is coming from Holy Cross. He's joining the staff. And I mean, it's almost hilarious. Like, close your eyes and listen to them talk and try to guess which one's Bob Chesney and which one's Jacob Dobbs. Because like he just kind of brings that like entire mentality. Like you can tell he's the leader coming in and the guy who kind of bridged that gap between new staff and players that are coming back. Because he's beyond the fact that he put up big numbers at the FCS level and should be able to play pretty well at the group of 5 level. I think he's just, definitely going to be one of the leaders of this team. A guy who I'll be shocked if he doesn't go into coaching when he's done playing. And he's a name I think you're going to hear a lot in the fall when JMU gets out there and starts playing.
So you think Dobbs and Jones are kind of the two main linebackers for 2024?
Yeah, and I didn't mention Trent Hendrick, but he's another guy who's been good when he's gotten the opportunity to be out on the field for JMU, and he got some starts last year when both Jones and Walker were hurt. They went with Hendrick and Fisher, and there was no drop off really. And Fisher stayed in the starting lineup. Hendrick, was kind of in and out, but they played him a lot last year. Linebacker, the first string anyway, is a place where they're going to look pretty good. I don't know what the depth is going to be like, but their starters should be good at linebacker.
Well, let's take a look at the defensive backfield. They suffered losses this offseason as well, losing D'Angelo Pons, Francis Meeham, Chris Chukwaniki, Q Reed, Devin Coles, but they do return Jacob Thomas, Chauncey Logan, DJ Barksdale, among others. How did that unit look in the spring, and who's going to step up to fill these vacated roles?
Yeah, that's an area where they're still bringing guys in the portal right now. As they're still recruiting the portal pretty hard, especially at cornerback. Jacob Thomas kind of had a breakout year at safety last year. And Chauncey Logan's a guy who basically been a starter since his first day on campus at cornerback. So they've got some good players in spots there, but the depth is going to be a question mark. And, how quickly they kind of integrate some of these guys who are still either just committing here in recent days or maybe kind of expected to commit soon as they I think we don't even know who's necessarily going to be playing cornerback for them opposite Logan in the coming this fall, because that's an area where they're really still trying to piece together a unit.
If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
I could say maybe, just talked about Jacob Dobbs a lot, a guy who, if you just want to call it a breakout, just because he's coming from the FCS level where he was a really good kind of, All-American type of player. And in the past, JMU has had success with guys who have moved up from the FCS to G5, whether it's guys who were already at JMU when they made the transition or guys who transferred in from FCS schools because they wanted to move up too. Those guys have had a lot of success at JMU, and I think he's one of those guys who's going to prove to be a top level FCS player who makes the transition well, and then will kind of just be a breakout because people didn't see him playing for JMU last year, and maybe if you didn't follow FCS football as much, might be surprised that it's a name you hadn't heard a lot, but he'll be out there making a lot of plays.
The last 2 years, JMU's defensive unit as a whole has been really, really strong, especially for the G5. Do you think that that's going to continue? I mean, I think the natural inclination is there's going to be some step back, but I guess how much of a step, if there's going to be a step back, how much do you think there might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be some step back because just like I said, the linebackers were so deep last year that, when they had some injuries, you didn't even see a drop off. And I don't know if something like that's going to be the case like this year where they can survive injuries like that. The defensive line was just absolutely dominant last year. A special group that you're not going to put together a unit like that very often, even for a successful program. So I think, there'll be some step back, and that's going to happen. There's going to be some probably growing pains with new staff doing things a little bit differently. They've been very successful defensively, that staff previously. I think when they get their program in place at JMU, we'll continue to think of JMU as a really good defensive team, but it'll be very, very difficult to continue to play at the level where they just took a lot of pressure off the offense last year with what they were able to do defensively.
Now that the spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you feel is the most concerning?
I think it probably still has to be a secondary. Like I said, it's just so many question marks of, guys you either didn't see in the spring because they're coming in now, or, depth. They felt pretty good about having D'Angelo Pons, who was a freshman All-American last year. He stuck with them in December and then ends up transferring after the spring game when he was looking good. And when you had him and Logan at the corners, I think you felt a little bit more comfortable with where everything was at secondary-wise. But, I mean, now it's a big question mark in the passing game, how they're going to cover guys, whether or not they're going to get burned on the outside. I think we'll see guys step up in other places where, they, like I said about the defensive line, they can't be as good as they were last year, but I think they're going to be good enough on the defensive line. I think, the cornerback position in particular is the one that's going to be a big question mark.
So you said that they, mentioned they might be looking to add there in the transfer portal here. Are they shopping for anything else to maybe add to the team?
I think, maybe see some more wide receivers just to add depth there. If they can get anybody experienced or a real possession type of guy at wide receiver. They only got a couple of scholarships left to work with at this point, either maybe 3 or 4. Roster's always kind of in flux, but I think they're up in the 80 scholarship range at this point. So they can bring in a handful of guys maybe, but I would be shocked if there's not another defensive back or two, probably a wide receiver, and then anywhere you can fill in some depth, probably like on the defensive line, they could probably use a little bit more depth, even though the starters look pretty solid. So that would be my inclination, is those will be the places they look here in the next month or so.
What would you say is the main strength of this team?
That's hard to even answer, like how little we've seen kind of the new staff and everything. But, talking about, I think linebacker will be a strength, especially, like I said, the first unit, if they can keep all those guys healthy, that should be a real strength. And then running backs, I think we'll see them try to control tempo and things with the running game a little bit more than in the past, just because those guys seem like, at least from what we saw in the spring, those guys seem like guys who can make plays. And I think they'll probably, let them do what they do with the ball in their hands.
When it comes to the recruitment of new players and the retention of existing players, how has NIL and the transfer portal impacted James Madison? I mean, we kind of alluded to it the whole time, but what's it? I mean, I feel like from a step back, I live in Iowa, seeing this. What is it like, being down there and seeing this?
Yeah, it certainly affects James Madison, as it does everybody. And, it was a frustrating offseason for a lot of fans, I think, just in the fact that they lose the coaching staff to Indiana, and a lot of those guys who could have come back as starters at JMU this year end up going to Indiana. And, even some of the ones who went to Indiana were not necessarily the ones that, like, I think JMU fans would have been wringing their hands as much about losing if it hadn't been that they went with the previous coaching staff. And so there's a lot of consternation there. And those guys are getting, good NIL money to go to the Big Ten. Like, Indiana wants to improve their football program. That's why they made the hire. That's why they are investing money in it. And, JMU can't compete with that, like just a pure NIL. And, probably, like, there's always going to be guys who are going to want to take that next step up and prove that they could play at the highest level, and will go for that. And JMU's always kind of had the success of being able to locate people who were capable of moving up from that. I mean, James, this is just kind of, an anecdotal thing. James Carpenter is one of the guys we talked about losing on the defensive line. Has had a really, really great career at JMU, and I'm guessing will have success at the Big Ten. He came to JMU as a walk-on at the FCS level. JMU's had a history of finding those guys. And with NIL now and the transfer portal and everything else, it's just going to continue to be important to find those guys who were undervalued and then keep them for a little while. And you may lose them before the end of their career, but, you got to find those guys who are capable of playing at the Group of Five level that, maybe either, the Big Ten teams, the SEC teams weren't going to take a gamble on a guy like that, but you trust your evaluation enough to say, we're going to win with these players. And, whether or not we're paying them a ton of money or not, they're not going to get rich playing at JMU, but there's a collective, there's some things in place that shouldn't keep them competitive, in the Sun Belt, but there's certainly some frustration in the fact that there's not necessarily a level playing field as far as across the board with college football.
This next question might be hard to assess given it's a brand new coaching staff, but it seems more and more that the demands of a head coach are really turning to more things that, like a general manager. He has to, recruit freshmen, recruit from the portal, work on retaining his current roster. He has fundraising, and then maybe he's not as involved in the X's and O's. Have you seen this at JMU, or have they hired additional personnel to kind of try and help with some of those responsibilities?
Yes and no, like to both of those. I mean, Chesney is a guy who, and I've said this before to other people on other shows and everything, but like when in the Sun Belt in particular this offseason, we saw schools losing, pretty successful head coaches to be Power 5 assistants. Like it happened at South Alabama and some places that are peers of JMU. And like I think one of the keys now, if you're a group of 5 program, is you've got to hire somebody who really wants to be a head coach. And, maybe it doesn't matter if they're making $100,000 less as a head coach than they would as a coordinator somewhere, but they really want that head coaching responsibility. And Bob Chesney seems to be a guy who does, and that means taking on everything that you mentioned, the GM role, but still being very like involved in, the schemes and the X's and O's. And I think he's young, relatively young. He brings a ton of energy to the program, and it's across the board. It's in recruiting and player and roster development, and it's also in fundraising and getting out in the community for charity events and things that maybe the previous staff didn't do a ton of. He does a lot as a head coach and wants to do a lot as a head coach, but also at the same time, if JMU fans are a little annoyed about the way Kurt Cignetti left, they can at least give him some credit for he did put some things in place. He did recognize even 2-3 years ago, we need more staffing. That's not just coaching personnel. We need a guy, 2 or 3 people who are going to, manage our recruiting. And that isn't just like, being out actively recruiting players. It's also like saying like, here's how the roster is going to look. Here's how we're going to break things down. And sort of like you said, they're not necessarily at the GM level of responsibility, but they're akin to like the people who work in the front office of an NFL team, as far as just like, evaluating rosters, evaluating who else is playing in the league. I mean, that's one thing that, coaches used to stay in their office until 4 a.m. watching high school film. They don't do that anymore. Now they've got somebody who's watching, they're watching the Mountain West for them, because like they don't see them in game film very much, but they're out there watching to see who might end up in the portal. And they've got other people doing that. So JMU did up their staffing as far as like non on the field coaching positions and people to kind of do that. But a lot of it still falls on the head coach at that level. And Bob Chesney's a guy who I think just embraces all of it.
You talked a little bit about the collective that they have there. What is the collective? When did it start? Do you feel like, JMU's ahead of the 8 ball, behind the 8 ball, right on pace? Because some G5 teams really seem to embrace it early on and got ahead of it, and some were resistance a little bit. Where's JMU in that?
Yeah, kind of in the middle. I'd say right on pace. I don't think, they're not at the forefront of NIL really necessarily. But they got involved. They were pretty. So the collective is called the Montpelier Collective, and it's run by a guy who used to be in charge of the Duke Club, which is the booster club that's affiliated with the university, and he's now semi-retired. And this was kind of like, it was good timing for him when he wanted to retire, that NIL also came about at the same time, because it let him keep his foot in the door and get involved and let JMU have somebody who had experience with that kind of fundraising take over. But they were also pretty cautious, as the term Wild West gets tossed around a lot. And, those first early days of NIL, we heard all kinds of crazy stories about, boosters making offers to kids that the coaches weren't even recruiting and things like that. And all of that stuff, I think, left JMU being fairly cautious with it. I think it was probably over a year before they actually officially launched the collective. Although, Cliff Wood, who I mentioned before, was working on getting something in place basically from day one. But, they do a lot of fundraising for it. They've been able to keep some players, both football and basketball. They've lost guys basically because of NIL. but they've also retained some players, football and basketball wise, by using NIL, and they do things a little bit differently. It's charity based. Like they put basically we'll work with like a local group like a Red Cross or somebody and basically say, please hire this kid to do some appearances and things. And then the collective will pay a stipend for that, but they're not doing like advertising with Adidas or State Farm or whatever. They do keep it in that realm, which, not to get too much in the weeds, has allowed them to keep a beneficial tax situation compared to some other ones. But they've been cautious, but also realizing that it's very important that they step up the NIL game if they want to continue to compete at the level that they have.
All right. Well, that's good to know. So, given all the recent success and all the changes in the coaching staff and personnel, Shane, the 2024 season has come to an end. What does success look like for JMU Dukes in 2024?
They finished first in the Sun Belt East the past 2 years. Didn't get to be officially Sun Belt East champions because of the transition thing, and that's a rub for a lot of JMU fans. They call themselves Kings of the East.
The Kings of the luckily, the NCAA saved all the other teams from JMU because JMU not ready to battle.
Yeah. But to answer your question, I think winning the East division is probably considered a successful season, and I don't think they're going to do it with one loss like they did a year ago. But it's going to be a competitive division as it has been the past few years. Maybe by the end of the year, we're saying, hey, if they get to a bowl game again and have a winning record, that's pretty good for a first year staff. But, I think that it's kind of been established now that, winning the East is kind of the benchmark for this program. And if they do that, and then they'll get a chance to play in the Sun Belt Championship game this time around, I think people will be pretty satisfied with that. I'm not saying they're going to do that, but I'm saying that would be something everybody would be, even if they're not winning 11 games, I think they'd be pretty happy with winning the East.
So we've talked a lot of JMU today, offense, defense, coaching changes, NIL. But is there anything else that you want to share or think we should know about this 2024 James Madison Dukes football team?
Not off the top of my head. I mean, we got pretty in depth, and I'm like you guys in a lot of ways, kind of waiting to see what we see in the fall, because it's going to be different, and it's going to be a lot of new faces and new style. But I think probably maybe the one thing we didn't talk about as much is just I hinted at it a little bit, but Bob Chesney brings a completely different kind of energy than Kurt Signetti, as far as just being like out there with the people, interacting with fans, interacting with people around town. I think that's going to be huge, as far as just like, as down as people were about losing the staff and losing a lot of players and everything, somebody who comes in and like keeps the energy around the program as they, think about expanding the stadium and things like that. Like, I think that's going to be pretty huge, that, they ride out the transition with a guy who's going to keep people upbeat regardless of what's happening.
Yeah, they had the pretty cool, coach for the day, I think, for the spring game, which was a pretty awesome idea, I thought.
Yeah, that was part of the collective thing too. That was a raffle where it all went to the collective. So they've done some like some interesting things as far as trying to keep up with everything that's changing in college sports.
All right. Well, thanks again, Shane, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today.
All right. Thanks for having me.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.